Thank you, and thank you for being with us today. And we're going to start with a little basics. Allison, tell us about the Keck Foundation.
That is basic. Well, you think in our history starting in 1954 that sounds sort of ancient and not very startup or high tech. But at the time, the money came from a man with an 8th grade education named W.M. Keck. And he came across the country and started drilling dry holes, and finally on the 29th struck oil. And did a lot of that work with CalTech early on in the 30s, and figured out that there was collaboration back then among universities and industry. And in the 50s, began working with basic science because of how much it had helped him. And we continue to this day working towards helping be a spark plug for science at the very forefront before the government can come in and fund and before others will. And we try and keep it quite broad and responsive to what we think of as our marketplace, which is the research universities and institutions in the country.
Now, we know you've focused on basic scientists, so you've had really 3 kind of venture capitalists, aggressive entrepreneurs who have chaired the Keck Foundation from its beginning. Why basic science?
Basic science for a couple reasons. We are a drop in the bucket, and we'll be talking more about that, I'm sure, today, of the research dollars in the country. So where are we going to make the most with that very small amount of money? And also because without fundamental knowledge, you won't have applied research and people who will come in and commercialize products. So we try to fund where others won't yet.
So venture capital funding and basic research.
Yes.
All right. CalTech, one of the great academic institutions in the history of the world, located right here in the area, greater Los Angeles area. Tell us a little bit about CalTech. Why did you take the position as the 9th head of CalTech?
Right.
You were running your own laboratory, having the beautiful weather of Chicago.
Exactly.
How did they convince you to come out here to California?
They paid a lot for my snow shovels. No, it's been a fantastic move. CalTech is small, but it tries to pick out big problems, and people are fearless. And we actually have a model that's different than most of our peers in that we don't intend to grow, we just want to get better. And so there's an intellectual discipline and rigor about always thinking, what is the best problem to be working on? If you're going to do this, what aren't you going to do? And we create an environment, a culture, where people are inspired to cross disciplinary boundaries to do this. We also assume a lot of risk, and we'll talk about this, but that's one of the beautiful things about private philanthropy, is that it is more accommodating of risk. And really, that's our business model, if you will, and we've leveraged that to explore the outer fringes of the solar system, discover quarks, figure out how the Earth works, take measurements of changes in the Earth's environment, and try to contribute not only to creating knowledge for the long term, but also to solve humanity's problems today.
So those watching this online or here with us today might want to wonder, how many spots do you have in that freshman class?
So we admit about 235 students a year, and they're just extraordinary students. We have about 300 graduate students a year. So we're a niche player in some ways, but we're all about leverage.
And we should point out, as you think about whether you want your children to apply to CalTech, they also have by far the highest test scores of your incoming freshman class, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Although it's, that's only one measure of both ability and accomplishment. We're really looking for students who want to do something special, who have demonstrated aptitude in science and engineering, and also commitment to that, because as in any profession, you just have to love it and be passionate about it to really succeed.
I might want to add something.
Go on.
Everyone knows that there are more Nobel Prize winners, more MacArthur Genius Award winners, and more patent holders per capita at CalTech than any other university, not only in the United States, but in the world. But what they may not realize...
Dick, is this the reason you joined the board?
Just one of them. But what is most interesting is that in the history of the Nobel Prize, of all the Nobel Prize winners in the United States, more than 10% are either professors at CalTech or have graduated from CalTech. So
Dick?
I just find that fascinating, and later I will talk about why I believe that you fish where the most fish are, or you invest in areas where the greatest brains are, and where they don't do iterative science, they don't try to improve 10%, they try and improve tenfold.
Right. So, Bob, you've talked to us over time about the ladder analogy of different types of research. Could you walk us through today your ladder analogy of different types of research and funding choices for the investors, for the philanthropists that are watching this or with us today?
Be happy to. I was one of you. That is, I was a managing director at a venture capital firm when I retired from the University of California, San Diego. I keep failing retirement. But there is, as a venture capitalist, I had many of my colleagues in the business say we actually don't do basic science. That is, the gap and the ability to predict outcomes and return on capital was simply so uncertain when you were really truly talking about basic science, truly fundamental science, that the risk profile is too high for actual venture investment. So the latter analogy that Michael is asking me to chat about is fundamentally this. If you don't understand at the most basic level the material science, the biology, the cell biology, the electronics, the so on and so forth. You pick the field. If you don't understand it at its most fundamental level, then you don't know what to do next. And I'll give you an example in cancer research. In the 50s and 60s, we were going to have a war on cancer. There have been many wars on cancer. Very little progress was actually made until the early 1970s. And one of Tom's predecessors, David Baltimore, one of the youngest of the Nobel Prize winners who's ever won the Nobel Prize, won it in the 1970s. And it was part of a transition at the NIH where they said, we don't understand the fundamentals of cancer. And we think we can develop drugs to target this or that. We don't know what we're targeting. And they went back to basic molecular and cell biology. And the advances in cancer research since the early 1970s have been just stunning. Why have they been stunning? Because we fundamentally understand the nature of cell biology associated with cancerous and non-cancerous cells in a much more powerful way. And so that very bottom rung, from a ladder point of view, is where people are doing the kind of very basic research. Why does nature behave as it does? And what are the fundamentals underlying the mechanisms by which outcomes come? And so that's the bottom rung of the ladder. And if you don't have solid knowledge, whether it's physics, chemistry, geology, the life sciences, etc., your chances of making a serendipitous discovery and then moving ahead, while not zero, are much, much lower. The next layer up is what in medicine they now call translational life science. We're going to take this basic knowledge and we're going to translate it into something. We might translate physical science advances in material science or in nanoscience to create an instrument that enables a robot to do robotic surgery. Okay, fine. There's both cross-disciplinary, but I understand the basics. I know how to write the software. It's a big engineering development, but I don't need fundamentally new knowledge. You can invest in it, and you can predict the time horizon for success or failure. Now it's questions of execution, the right people, and so on. So translational medicine is an example of the next rung, but the same thing exists on the physical sciences side. And at that point, when those risks are taken out, now's the point where you can get to the first ladder on the economic and investing ladder. Now you're ready to say, I can do this. The science risk is taken out. There is engineering risk. There is technology risk. There may be software risk. But I can assess those risks in a sensible way and make a return on capital style of analysis and come up and say, I'm going to do your seed round, or I'm going to do your A round. And so that's the third ladder. By the way, at that point, industry comes in a big way. They are doing a lot of similar work. Once the risk is taken out, they don't do any longer truly deep fundamental biological and life science research. That's why the exit market in the biopharma industry, you get to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, you're worth a fortune because you've taken the risk out for big pharma. And so that's the next level of the ladder, and the last is, economic success at the top. But at the bottom, if you don't understand, you don't know how to translate. If you don't know how to translate, you can't get a business plan together. And if you can't do that, you can't get funded, and so it goes.
Well, Bob, I want to thank you for taking us up the ladder, and all of us wish we could make it all the way up that ladder. Unfortunately, as we know, many of the things you work on. So I want to follow up on a couple of Bob's points and then go to Dr. Merkin. First, it's very interesting to reinforce that point. 1993, I'm diagnosed with cancer, told I have 18 months to live. I go out and see my friend Gordon Binder at Amgen. Tell Gordon, Gordon, I need you to divert $500 million a year to cancer. Gordon says, this is a public company. It's not my company. I said, but aren't we friends? He said, yes. However, there isn't enough strength in basic science yet for us to increase our commitment. I get a call a couple years later, 95. There are really some breakthroughs in basic science in Amgen. Much of their growth has related to things in cancer ever since that date, emphasizing your point. Another thing I want to stress that we heard up here, if you look at the Milken Institute reports, you can go online, best places to live, fastest growing cities, best places to retire, you'll find every single one of those, there's a university in the area. And so if you look at cities, you're looking for the strength of that university, and speaking about the University of California, San Diego, which was actually founded pretty much to focus on science. Our work with them, plus Scripps and Salk and what was now called Sanford Burnham, created over the last 25, 30 years the city that has the most biotech companies of any one city in the United States today, centered on that university. And lastly, I want to comment on another point, and a rate of return potential. We had invested $5 million, and Dr. Merkin joined me, and Dr. Baltimore, previous president of CalTech, as Dr. Merkin were both initial founding trustees of Faster Cures. But we invested about $5 million in something called the Celebration of Science to reaffirm the country's commitment to bioscience in this case. And the National Center for Advancing Translational Science that exists today was funded by the federal government for $6 billion. So you got 1,200 times your money in a short period of time. So I'd like to turn now, Dr. Merkin, to one of the first issues that we can all comment, is that is young scientists, getting them interested. I know Dr. Baltimore told me you kind of get them interested in science before they're 12, whether it's bugs, whether it's going to the moon and space travel, whatever it might be. And I want to show you a picture here, an unusual picture of a high school student. It wasn't even a senior. I think he was in 10th grade, Jack Andraka, Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, and a Nobel Prize winner, previous president of CalTech, David Baltimore. An unusual grouping. Let's take a look maybe at this video on Jack as to why this group got together.
Maybe if we caught it earlier. That's what the doctor said about my uncle's pancreatic cancer. Like that was even possible with the testing they had. But what did I know? I was too young to understand things like cancer, or how to test for it. Too young to be taken seriously. 199 experts told me I was too young, that they didn't have time for my little science fair project. But the way I saw it, if the key was early detection, maybe someone just needed to start looking earlier. Like during 5th period freshman biology.
So a lot of things come together in that video. One, the Gordon Moore Prize, one of the major benefactors of CalTech, maybe the major benefactor of the university. And there's Jack with David Baltimore and Francis Collins. Dick, talk to us about supporting young scientists or young people.
Well, I believe, first of all, I'm a big believer in crazy ideas, because a crazy idea today will be a breakthrough tomorrow. The people that are supported by government, they've already broken through. They will have, their goal is to iterate. Their goal is to take something, not to have a new idea, but just to improve it a bit. What we want to do is support people that have brand new ideas, that are going to approach problems in a completely different way, and they will fail a lot of the time. And if they don't fail enough, then they're really not taking the risks that we want them to. So if you support young people and they look at problems and they develop solutions that are completely antithetical to the status quo, and they embrace change, those are the kinds of people that I want to support. And one element of these individuals is they collaborate. You take completely different academic disciplines. You take computational biology, molecular biology, organic chemistry, and they work together and they look at the problem orthogonally. They look at it from different views. They work together and they make change. And the people that I most want to support are the change agents, the people that are going to embrace change and change the world, not people that are going to improve things 5%.
All right, let's step back and talk. Obviously, freshmen, they're going to CalTech. This is an unusual group. You've described to us that they are interested in science, mathematics, physics, biology, and they're going to go in that field and they have ideas. What do you do to make sure they stay on that road?
Right. So one thing we do is we don't have them specialize too early. We insist that they're exposed to all the disciplines, all the scientific disciplines in engineering, and we encourage them to work with each other, to do problem sets together, to delve into issues as groups, and don't penalize them for doing that. It's not about individual credit, it's about a mode of inquiry and being able to attack problems and solve problems. We also get them into laboratories very early to do work. So 95% of our students do research during the summer. And so we try to create that environment. And you know, to build, I think, a bit on what others have said, and Dick just said, about investing in young people. He was talking about faculty members there. But there's a whole cultural ethos that's absolutely essential, that you have to get people to think about problems from different directions and bring them together to do that. So when Allison talked about the Keck Foundation's relationship to CalTech, that was because we basically started seismology and studying how waves propagate through the Earth and the structure of the Earth. And you can see how that would give a leg up then to drilling for oil, for the Superior Oil Company. But it also helps with medicine. We just hired someone from WashU Medical School who is trying to image organs deep inside the body. So he's shining light in through the skin that then sets up sound waves inside those organs, just like you have ultrasound, but without a transducer put on you. He came to CalTech because he wanted to talk to seismologists, because how they analyze waves propagating through the Earth is the same way that he needs to analyze the waves going through these organs. And so having this sort of culture, whether it's freshmen, whether it's faculty, being able to talk to each other, being unafraid to use different tools is absolutely essential. And so I at least tell the students, I'm not sure any of them actually listen to me, but I tell them that they shouldn't worry so much about which direction they're going, what major they're going to choose, because what we're teaching them to do, what we're equipping them to do is ask really good questions, to frame problems and know how to deal with those problems, and if not to solve them, to at least push it forward in an intelligent manner. And those skills are useful in all parts of society.
Allison, what's been your experience?
I think we are again trying to fill a gap, and with young scientists, federal funding is going down for basic research, and federal funding for young scientists is going even further. So we believe our mission is to make sure that we continue to give them that early career start. And there are different ways that we can do that. Bob and I have talked about this before, and one of the ways we did it for 10 years, we got together and gave $1 million a year to young scientists, similar to what you were doing in the biomedical field, across different fields. They came to us. And another way that we've done it quite recently, I looked back and we've taken it into our general programs and said, you know what, we may not do this so that we have a special program for young scientists, but what we'll do is if I looked back and 50%, over 50% of the applications that came in were from our senior scientists at research institutions. And we put a thumb on the scale, and we gave over 50% to the early career in the awards. So the applications came in at over 50% senior, and the money went back out the door over 50% early. So there are ways that we can try and say the youngsters of the world are the most creative.
Well, Bob, before I go to you, just a couple notes if we talk about the National Institute of Health. Most Nobel Prizes in all fields, David Baltimore being very young, were given for ideas that people have within 5 years of being in school, whether that's PhD, undergrad, grad. You might be 65 when you got it, but those ideas. And one of the things we've seen is that the first time today on the NIH of awards is generally around low 40s, 43 today. it's moved up substantially, 44. And
Yep.
so one of the things philanthropy has been very focused on is making sure these young scientists stay on that career path from that. Bob, you've dealt with people when you were young and interacted with one another.
So young at heart.
So you've seen them during the careers, and now that you're around mid-career today, how do you see that interaction between mentor scientists? I know in many of our programs, we funded about 500 young scientists, but we always require them to have a mentor. So the institution itself has to provide a mentor for that young scientist. And to get a little leverage, we require them to financially match. Bob, what's been your experience?
Don't be so gracious about describing my age. I start to feel a little, I'm older than I look, I think. So this is an opportunity for me, I think, to discuss different forms of philanthropy that get at a similar end. And your question here is about support for young people. We have at the Kavli Foundation, and Fred Kavli, by the way, was a similar immigrant, but similar entrepreneur who made his fortune, came from Norway in the mid-50s and made his fortune really with a company in the aerospace industry. In any case, sticking with young people and a variety of philanthropic approaches, we have taken the very radical and not widely used approach of actually endowing, that is transferring our wealth to the university to endow institutes in a series of areas. And those areas are, for example, in the biological sciences, neuroscience, the science of the brain and the mind. Nanoscience, astrophysics and cosmology, which is really physics, and theoretical physics. So we stay very focused on those four areas. But by doing it, by endowing these institutes, and also asking the institutes from time to time to develop matching funds.
Going to you now.
The institute at CalTech, which is the Kavli Institute in Nanoscience, now has an endowment that's going to be growing north of $30 million. Endowment. It's probably going to be one of the largest endowed institutes when it's finished at this great university. What is it to enable? We put no constraints on what the faculty who are associated with that institute use the resources for. We say, you determine the best and highest use in support of your scientific field. They breathe a sigh of relief. It's everything else that they get by way of funding from the government is prescribed. They've got to write reports. They've got to do this and that. They choose, we've observed across 20 institutes around the globe, they choose to spend always some fraction on their young students, support for graduate students, support for their postdocs, and sometimes support for their newly hired faculty, which is, we've transferred the responsibility of choosing how best to support the young people to those universities whom we have bet on. And by betting on them, by giving them endowments, we say we basically have made a forever bargain with you. The only way we stay relevant to you is probably to threaten to give more. But it is a way of enabling freedom of inquiry in the most high-risk areas. And so those universities where so much of the funding is prescribed by the grants that the people get, this is the kind of money that gives them the freedom to really pursue their highest and craziest ideas. And we're just delighted by it. Most of those then get pursued by young people. And so it's an alternative model getting at basically the same issue. How do you really support the best and the brightest within the fields of science at universities particularly, both students and faculty?
So being creative in how you approach philanthropy and leveraging is one of the things Bob has said here. One of the things we discovered about 25 years ago is that if we could shorten the period of time that you got an answer if you applied, you had far more people applying. And two, similar to some of the ideas Bob put forth, If we told you that if you wanted to submit 1,000 pages, we only promised to read the first 5. And it could be an idea, we don't need any results. It's amazing the talent that will respond. But there's one other strategy I know that, Dick, that you and Heritage have deployed. What happens if you don't even know the people? Anyone in the world is potentially can make a contribution. Dick, talk to us about the Heritage Prize and your strategy of trying to put out a question, a contest, and what the responses have been.
Sure. So we talked about academic institutions and PhDs, but there are others that can help, citizen scientists. So we wanted to develop an algorithm to see who would be hospitalized in any given patient population within the next year. So we put the data online.
And Dick, tell them why you wanted to do that.
Well, we thought that there was a lot of waste in the medical system. We thought that the future of the medical system, healthcare, is an information science. It's no longer memorizing disease and memorizing diagnoses and matching it. Medicine in the third decade of the 21st century will be radically different than it has been in the past. And being that it's an information science, we put data online to see if we could predict who would be hospitalized within the next year. And if we could predict who, we could focus our efforts on preventing those unnecessary hospitalizations and treat disease before it became so severe that it needed to be hospitalized. So we did that. We vetted it with most of the health plans and insurance companies in America, and they said, well, if you could get a 50% specificity and rate, we would be blown away. We also vetted it with Intel and Microsoft, and they asked for 99.9999. We decided 85%. We put it online. We got 39,000 entries from 41 countries. Statisticians, stochastic modelers, computer science. That alone saved just our small little company $90 million annually in reduced utilization.
Okay, Dick, so let's just slow down for a moment if we could. How much did you have to invest in this to generate $90 million per year?
So think about that. It was a $3 million prize, and we spent maybe $2 million running the contest. So think of it as venture capital. In venture capital, you're placing your bets broadly. Win or lose, you're spending the money. Doing what we did with incentivized competition, we were only paying for the winners. And we did that. So when you think about a $3 million or $4 million total cost, $90 million a year, but that's not a one-time.
Well, assuming you're selling at 90 times EBITDA, not 10 times, so $900 million on a $5 million investment, right?
Something like that.
Okay. So I think the underlying issue here is, so how many of these individuals did you know before you started the prize?
0.
How many of them were working in the field of medicine?
None. They came from, the winners came from Australia and the Netherlands, those were and they didn't know each other, and each one approached it differently, and together they had a better solution than each individually. So we first met them when they came for the grand awards.
And did you have any hedge fund operators?
Well, not at the time, but they were so good at this, they started their own hedge fund.
So there is an opportunity when you want to accomplish something, the point being here, you can go out to the world and see if they have insight. I just want to show you one quick story along these lines. So we all remember the terrible oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. and they were not able to shut down it for days, weeks, months. You had the world's largest companies working on this issue, because if you could figure out how to shut down an oil spill, everywhere it occurred in the world, you could do this. And so Stephen Chu was a Nobel Prize winner, who happened to be the Secretary of Education at the time. Exxon, everyone was trying to help BP. When it was over and the disaster had occurred and at enormous costs, particularly to BP and society, they put out a prize. And you had to be able to do it twice as good in this prize. A $1.4 million prize. And there were 7 groups that came out that could substantially do it better than the world's biggest companies, the Department of Energy, everyone around the world. One of those groups was run by Fred. Now, who's Fred? Fred ran a tattoo parlor in Las Vegas. Ted didn't know anything about energy. He didn't know about oil spills, but what he was an expert in is getting tattoos off your body. And Fred figured out using this technique better than all the major companies. And this is why what your experience was, and being very inquisitive. Dr. Merkin has been following Fred once he won this award, and noticed, what did he do? He gave up his tattoo power?
Gave up his tattoo, and there's oil spills all over the world, and now he travels from place to place and cleans up oil spills.
Okay, so as you think about being a philanthropist, we wanted to challenge you, no matter what the area, and as Dick referred to, the citizen scientist who's intrigued in this area. So I'd like to maybe switch to a different question from our panelists here. What can the people that are watching us or in the room today do to help each of you advance scientific understanding? Whether they're investors, whether they're philanthropists, whether they're working at academic institutions today, what could they do? And Tom, let's start with you.
So I think there's something philosophical, which is to value the scientific method, to talk about the fact that there are problems out there that need to be solved, can be solved with science and with engineering, that we've created structures in this country and have a long tradition of supporting them that permit us to improve society that way. So that's something everybody can do in terms of talking about the values and the history of this country. More specifically, certainly philanthropists have a huge impact on our ability to move into new fields, our ability to try new things, to leverage our investments already, and to be able to bring together people, to convene people to think about the best way forward. Crowdsourcing is one way, as you talked about that way. But the Kavli Foundation is a fantastic example with the BRAIN Initiative of bringing together scientific institutions and philanthropists and talking about how would an investment in understanding how our minds work, how our perception of the world evolves, would government investment then make a huge difference? So gravitational waves, which many of you read about recently, this incredible discovery that when 2 black holes merge, they distort space-time, send ripples across the universe, which let us see things about the universe that we could never see in any other way. That started with the $10 million investment through the Moore Foundation at CalTech to build a prototype. ROI was good too there, $1.5 billion from the National Science Foundation. So there are ways that early investment with the right values and the right modalities can just change the way we understand the world and how we intercede in the world.
Allison, let me change the question a little bit for you. First, Keck is known to collaborate with many organizations. What makes for an effective partnership? And second, kind of what qualities does Keck seek when deciding which programs to fund?
just to follow on a little bit with what Tom was talking about and roll into that answer, I think you need to remember to both, I think it's analogous between philanthropy and venture capital, and that is be responsive, listen to the marketplace, whether that's the academic marketplace or the commercialization marketplace, and listen early, make your bet and get out of the way and do it quickly, as you were saying. So I think that that's important, and we try to make sure that we embody those qualities. And in the meantime, know that we know very little, and to make sure that we're talking to others and that we have others talking to each other, whether that's, you said, crowdsourcing across, or something like the Keck Institute for Space Studies at CalTech, where we helped establish a think and do tank, and there was seed funding involved. And out of that, again, leverage, get out of the way, and see what can happen. They were able, in a small study with a group of young faculty and students, to come up with the idea of a near-Earth asteroid retrieval that NASA then picked up and industry's picking up as well, to try and go forward. What does that do for all of us? It could change the way we think of physical science and geology and materials, and that can translate into industry years from now. But we really do need to be a spark plug and get out of the way.
So, Allison, I have to ask you, I went up to the top of the Mauna Kea mountain, which I learned was the tallest mountain on Earth because it goes 15 or 16,000 feet below the water. In addition, it looks like Mars on the top of that mountain. But those Keck telescopes up there.
Yep.
Tell us, Keck has probably done more than any one philanthropy group, any one foundation for the search of space and telescopes. Where did that passion come from?
Being told you can't do it, I really think.
So you hear that? If you want Keck to fund you, just first tell them they can't do it, okay?
And keep your rejection letters. Young Jack should keep his rejection letters from the film earlier. And we look and ask for your rejection letters from the government when you come and ask for funding from us as an academic. And if it says you did not get funding from the government because it's too risky, you get an A, and we'll give you some money.
Okay. So, Bob, can philanthropists, private funders, citizen scientists, is it possible to accelerate the process from getting from basic science to implementation, commercialization? The fact that computers are 1 million times faster today, is there a way to compress this process?
Well, that would be a full-day topic all by itself. I actually think the answer is yes. And I had a slide that they may find which shows private support and the government support and so on.
Well, let's take a look at that.
If you can find it. I think the real point is this, and we've sort of implied it earlier. Let me just explain here, because this is an opportunity to make a point that's very important if you're considering philanthropy. What to do, how to do it. First, you see above the line there, it's called the Science Philanthropy Alliance. It was something that the Moore Foundation, the Kavli Foundation, the Jim Simons Foundation, Jim in Maryland, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and so on, began about 3 years ago, and we have a CEO who was a former dean of science at MIT, Mark Kastner. The main point is there are extraordinary fortunes being made. Some of you have made them. And they've been made since the time that Michael got into the business in the 80s. There weren't these same fortunes being made in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was a different economy. It was a manufacturing economy. The economy of the 80s, 90s became private equity, and it became venture capital, and it became et cetera. So what will one do with the money? We have an extraordinary history of giving back in the United States, whether it's Carnegie's pledge, back 120 years ago. If you pass with all your money, you've probably died poor. to the Gates Buffett pledge, let's pledge to give at least half of our resources back. How will that happen? And if you're thinking about it and you're a business person, a finance person, I remember Jim Simons asking me before he said yes to joining, why would anybody on Wall Street invest in this? How would you say that it made a difference? And I think the answer is, think of it as the R&D feature of your philanthropic giving. If you were running a company and you had 20% in R&D or even 25 or 30, you'd think that was quite reasonable. That's your bet on the future. That's your bet on ensuring that you stay out in front. If you're a philanthropist and you want to solve cancer, or you want to solve Alzheimer's, or you want to solve whatever, the basic science is the 10, 15, 20% of your philanthropy that might ensure the foundation, that bottom rung on the ladder. That's where private giving really makes a difference. And that's what I would say to budding philanthropists. This little slide shows you simply, philanthropy is small relative to federal funding. And while Allison is right, in some areas of science funding, it's been flat to down, it's still enormous.
Yes.
The number, as best we've been able to determine it, is about $35 billion a year to basic fundamental science, not the translation, not the developing tools, et cetera, et cetera. And we know that private funding from all sources, as best we could calculate it, is north of about $2.5 billion, might be as high as $4 billion. $4 billion is still 10% of the federal government's funding. So one of the questions that I often hear and get asked is, can philanthropy replace federal funding for science? This tells you how hard that problem would be. You'd have to have foundations and private wealth, 20 times $35 billion. You'd need $700 billion worth of funding, spending 5% a year dedicated solely to science just to equal that big red circle.
Well, luckily, Bob, today, if we took the 50th wealthiest people and we took their net worth today, we'd have $2 trillion.
Right.
Okay, and if we could get them to give 3% to science, we'd have $60 billion a year. And so as we're redefining, as a member of the Giving Pledge myself, I would say the Giving Pledge collectively today is probably giving away about 12 to 14 billion a year.
Correct.
And with the addition of Zuckerberg and others, we're going to get more to science once we get your direction. Now, when I went to Wall Street in '69, from that standpoint, I always used to think, can we use the tools in one area? Could they be applied in another? Something you've funded a company in one area. And so when we talk, Dick, about science and technology, we're lumping together numerous disciplines, and historically, they hadn't always collaborated. And I know you and I have worked on this. Have you focused at all or thought about how you take the tools from one domain and apply them in another?
Sure. People may know that dogs have been trained to be sensitive to serotonin in Parkinson's disease, or
I think very few people know that.
Okay.
They might have been trained to sniff for bombs or drugs, etc.
or cortisol in stress, or diabetics. So a dog's olfactory senses are just much, much more powerful than a human's, on one hand. And on the other hand, in industry, you will have chips that can sniff out leaks in gases. So someone came up with, well, gosh, what if we programmed a chip so that they would be twice or 4 times or 100 times as sensitive as a dog's nose? So what they developed was a breath biopsy, where you could actually just breathe out and they could tell you before you became symptomatic, if you had a disease. So that's an example of taking something that was a tool in industry and using it in medicine. And my expectation is we will be doing more and more and more of that. As you can see, they can snip out for cancer, for narcolepsy, low blood sugar, seizures, fear, stress, etc. So,
Thank you, Dick. So we have a very short period of time, and I'd like to ask each of our panelists for just one short comment today on your experience in interaction. So let's start with yourself, Bob. In terms and thinking of yourself when you were at UCSD and as a researcher, what were the most effective qualities you had from a philanthropist in supporting work? What did you look for?
From a philanthropist supporting work that I was involved in?
Yes.
Well, most of my work, I must say, Michael, was about plasma physics and fusion energy, the source of the perpetual future. It's always 20 years off or 50 years off. So there weren't a lot of philanthropists involved. Where I really saw it was when I was at UCLA from 80 to 93. And I went down to UC San Diego in 93 to become the dean of their now Jacobs School of Engineering. And at the time, it was ranked, I think, 43 or 44 by US News and World Report. So why the hell did I want to leave UCLA and go to UC San Diego? UCLA's engineering school is ranked 13 or 14. Well, they did have on the faculty 8 members of the National Academy. I would go, I would make it 9. UCLA had 5. It would go down to 4. So there was an intrinsic value, but they were completely disorganized in terms of how to express that value. And I met Irwin Jacobs, and I met a number of other very generous people. And in the 8 years, we were able to raise approximately $300 million in private giving. The ranking of UC San Diego, its engineering school, went from 44 to 11, and it's still in the top 15. So what made that possible? It wasn't just the state of California putting up a hell of a lot more money. It was interacting with truly generous people who wanted to see success and had a commitment to the university. And they were willing to entertain giving back to enable greatness. And I think if you can express a vision of a truly great outcome, you will find people to be moved, and they will back you if those are your ideas. That was my experience as an academic. And you can move the needle big time.
Well, also, underlining your point, you also had talent to attract that donor. Allison, let's take it the other way. In the most effective partnerships you've had with academic institutions, what are the 1 or 2 qualities you've looked for?
The term interdisciplinary is very au courant. I would say that 15 years ago, it wasn't. What I want to make sure with universities is that it's not lip service, that the biology department doesn't get its faculty tenured in biology and chemistry, but that along the way, they're talking to each other. As we've talked about, the sciences, whether that's the technology groups that are helping medicine, and to make sure that as universities, that you're fomenting that creativity and getting out of the way in terms of bureaucracy.
Okay, Tom, my very young friend, Dr. Merkin, Dick, I think, has been one of your philanthropists. How has that partnership between the two of you, CalTech and Dick, worked out?
Even if Dick were not sitting to my left, the answer would be very simple. And it has worked fantastically because we share a passion. Dick is passionate about making a difference and supporting young people to allow them to make a difference. And that's what we're about. That's who we invest in. And we want to let them run with these ideas. And we also not only want them to run with these ideas, but we want them to know enough about how their work is intersecting with specific problems in society, in medicine in this case, So Dick's supporting some young faculty members in biology, computer science, engineering, chemistry, but all of who have latent interest in medicine and medical technologies. And so it is that combination of the passion to where we started, to develop that basic science, but to have it modulated by the applications that's been wonderful. Plus, they're just really great.
Well, I hope
faculty.
this afternoon you've enjoyed the 4 young panelists that have joined me today, their insight, and once again, the importance of philanthropy in supporting the science, serving as the venture capital element in that ladder that Bob spoke to us. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.